Good morning, good morning. We were originally going to be 5 panellists. Unfortunately, Ronnie Cowan, MP, isn't able to come because he's not well. And Ribeiro, Addy, MP, will be joining us shortly. She is in transit. But we have the 3 of us who will hopefully entertain and inform you for the next 40 minutes, regardless. My name's Steve Rolls. I'm Senior Policy Analyst for Transform Drug Policy Foundation, which is an NGO charity doing policy work and advocacy in the field of drug policy reform. Specifically around cannabis, we've spent the last 20 or 25 years advocating for cannabis legalization and regulation. We've produced a series of publications and books detailing what we see as a responsible model for adult use cannabis in a post-prohibition era. And as a result of that work, we have worked as consultants with a number of governments around the world as they have got to the point where they are ready to legalize and regulate. And that includes working with the federal government in Canada, back in Uruguay in the early days of the reform process about 10 years ago, and more recently with a number of European countries, including the governments of Luxembourg, Malta, Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. So we have a certain amount of experience actually doing the work of drafting legislation and working on legislation in that space. Our focus is much more on public health and sustainable development and social justice. We don't have any corporate sponsorship, and we're not involved directly with any industry stuff, although obviously industry are a stakeholder, and that's why we are here today. The theme of today's discussion is about harm reduction. Now, harm reduction as a concept is often seen in the public health space, so it's about reducing the harms associated with drug use, and obviously there is an important discussion around harm reduction with cannabis use, recreational cannabis use, which we're going to be focusing on today, although not necessarily exclusively. Harm reduction, there are harms associated with recreational cannabis, obviously, and there are public health concerns around that. I think the focus of today's discussion is more around the harms of policy, how the prohibitionist, punitive, enforcement-led environment impacts on the health harms, negatively, I would argue, but also creates this raft of other harms, criminalization of people who use cannabis, and the fueling of an illegal market that brings a whole series of secondary harms, empowering criminal groups, criminalization of vulnerable marginalized populations, and obviously the significant burden of criminalization falls most heavily on the marginalized populations. In the UK, it's particularly ethnic and black minority populations in urban areas in particular. I'm sure you're all very familiar with these arguments, so I'm not going to run over the arguments for legalization and regulation, but we're going to sort of dig into them and look at some of the experiences in the UK and Europe, and think about how reform can impact not just on the health harms of cannabis, but on the wider harms associated with prohibition. So having done that little intro, I'm going to introduce our speakers. We've got Ming Flanagan, who is a MEP for Ireland and a long-time friend of Transform and campaigner for drug law reform and specifically for cannabis reform in this context. And our other speaker is Lisa Townsend, who is the Police and Crime Commissioner, Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner for Surrey. Now, just as I am shamelessly biased and unabashedly non-objective in this, as someone who spent the last 20 or 25 years advocating for cannabis legalization, the panel is also, I think, fair to say, leaning towards the reform agenda. So we're not pretending that this is going to be a debate around the pros and cons of reform. These are all our speakers and me are all sort of, we don't share every position, but we are leaning towards a more pragmatic public health-based approach to cannabis, and are critical of the history of an enforcement-based approach and the harms that it causes. And it's interrogating those harms, which is where we're going to go to today. So, Lisa, if I can start with you.
You can.
You are, I think it's fair to say, at the more pragmatic end of conservative thinking. I mean, certainly some of your other conservative police and crime commissioners take a somewhat different position to you on these issues. I think it's been really interesting in the UK to see how, whilst things seem to be stagnating in Westminster, we have a late arrival. While things in many ways seem to be stagnating in Westminster in terms of the positions of the two main parties, we've seen a lot of reform happening at a local level. Now, not legislative reform, but certainly pragmatic on-the-ground reform and enforcement, in terms of pragmatic enforcement. Much of that has been addressing, hello, please welcome Addy, Ribeiro Addy, MP for Streatham. Has been addressing some of the problems associated with the historic harms of enforcement against people who use drugs. And a lot of the momentum reform has actually come from the police themselves, including, I think it's fair to say, some of the pragmatic police and crime commissioners, such as yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about that and your thoughts on how that process has happened and where it may be going and how it may actually influence the debate in Westminster and law reform as well?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I think that is part of the problem. We've talked about it a little bit earlier, which is that politicians, particularly those who, unlike myself, who sit in Westminster policy making and discussing these debates, don't often get involved in the same way, in a sort of practical, pragmatic way as the police do on the ground. And my role spans both of those. I'm an elected Conservative politician, but overseeing a very pragmatic sort of part of the state, which is the police force. And the police have to be pragmatic on the ground, and they only have their local area, which in my case is Surrey, to look after. So if they are going to be innovative, and I like to think that Surrey is an innovative force, they are doing so on the ground in their own patch, working with police and crime commissioners, but also working with other partners. So, you know, whether that's local authorities and councils, perhaps mayoral powers, working very closely with health and wellbeing boards, which are often part of councils as well, and hospital trusts. And so what they have to do is look at the harm, which is partly what we're here to do, but also they can't afford to just look at it from a position of having these conversations in Westminster. They have to be very, very pragmatic about it in a way that sometimes we as politicians don't always have the ability to do. And it's that sort of misuse, and it's where the harm comes into it. So in Surrey, we use a lot of out-of-court disposals. And that's particularly important when we're dealing with young people, because one of the things that's so important is that we don't criminalise young people. We talk a lot about, or we hear a lot of talk about, cannabis as a gateway drug. I don't see that. I don't see the evidence for it. Where I do see the gateway argument is cannabis as the way that cannabis is currently regulated or not, as a gateway into criminal gangs. So we know that cannabis is the most used drug in the UK. And we are seeing, certainly in Surrey, organised criminal gangs, particularly from the West Balkans, who traditionally would have used cocaine and were dealing in cocaine. They are now dealing in cannabis as well. And unfortunately, what's happening is cannabis is acting as a gateway drug for those young people caught up in county lines, which is a uniquely British problem. And so, from my point of view, what we need to do is look at regulation. And how do we take a product that is currently causing harm because of the way it's regulated and turn it into something, taking examples from the police where they're doing really good work locally and local authorities that are doing great work, and how can we translate that into a proper national policy? Because I do fear that Labour and the Conservatives are engaging in this sort of war on crime that is just going to be an arms race that ultimately isn't going to benefit anybody.
Yeah, and I'm gonna pick up on that with Belle in a moment. But first, I'd like to come to Ming. I think hardly anyone's had more experience on the front line of this debate than you. But I've been struck that the debate in Ireland, in many respects, seems to be a couple of steps ahead of the debate in the UK. And you've got this really quite religiously conservative country in many ways. And yet there is this really quite open, pragmatic debate happening around supervised drug consumption spaces, around decriminalisation. There's this citizens' assembly happening on drug policy, which I think a lot of people are quite optimistic will make some really quite progressive recommendations. What is it, do you think, about Ireland, or I mean, I don't know if you want to comment on Ireland and the UK, or one or the other, but how is it that that debate has moved forward in Ireland and seems to be somewhat, I don't know, restrained, certainly on the front lines? Sorry about that. Over to you.
I'd say one of the major reasons is why the debate has moved on a bit, and it's certainly moved on in a different direction to the UK, because I remember about 20 years ago standing in a hall in Galway celebrating the fact that David Blunkett, even though he couldn't actually see, had more vision than any of our politicians on this issue. And unfortunately, it seems to have gone backwards since. And in the Republic of Ireland, I think politicians have taken a lot of courage out of previous experience with the thing called citizens' assemblies, whereby we, through a randomised process, we choose 100 people from Ireland, we put together an expert group, and we have a debate over a number of months on an issue. We did this on abortion, and before that debate took place, it was a very, very difficult political subject. I voted in the Irish Parliament on a proposal from an independent socialist TD or MP about 3 years previously on the issue of abortion, and from my memory, there was 20 voted in favour of what she was proposing, and there was 144 voted against. But we ended up having a citizens' assembly on abortion, and there was a debate, and there was a discussion about all the details about fetal abnormalities, all of the particulars about some people saying we should only have it in cases of a rape. Then there was a debate about how do you prove whether someone was raped or not? Do you have to wait until a court case, etc.? So it went through this big debate. And something that was a massively hot topic ended up becoming more understood. And even in a place, and I love where I come from a county called Roscommon, very, very politically conservative. And we voted in favour of legalising abortion in a county where most young people leave, where the population is more elderly than any other county in Ireland, and we voted in favour of it. Likewise, we had a citizens' assembly on marriage equality or gay marriage, and something which was, when I was in school, I'm getting old, but I'm not that old, it was illegal to be a homosexual. You had situations when I was doing my Leaving Cert where you had a judge cross-examining someone while people laughed at the person who was being cross-examined in court about why would a man want to have sex with another man. In Ireland, after this debate, we voted, as far as I know, the first public vote on the planet, we voted in favour of the legalisation of gay marriage. Now we have a citizens' assembly on drugs, which started in the last couple of weeks, will run most likely until the end of the year. There will be 5 or 6 meetings over weekends where 100 people will get together. Now, initially, and I would have been one of the people who was sceptical about how this was put together, initially people were quite sceptical about the expert group that was put together because they were meant to be guiding these 100 people. Many people who wanted it legalised and people that I know felt that the expert group was too much biased against the idea of legalisation. But having watched the first few debates, it's quite clear to me that the citizens of Ireland are actually ahead of the political norm in Ireland, and they are well educated on the topic. And for me, I can see potentially a similar result coming out of this citizens' assembly. But obviously, with abortion and with gay marriage, there had to be a referendum, which was a political outcome out of this citizens' assembly. There won't be a referendum on this because it's not in the Irish constitution that cannabis should be illegal, but it will put pressure on politicians. Now, I would be a little bit cynical about it. I think politicians are elected to rule and to come up with laws that are best for the population in general. I think a citizens' assembly is very helpful to cowardly politicians who need a signpost to tell them what direction to go in. But if that's the way it has to be done, then so be it. There has been other developments in Ireland over the last few years as well. We've now got an adult caution scheme, which, look, on the surface produces better figures. In 2020, we had 11,127 prosecutions in Ireland for the possession of cannabis. In 2021, that dropped to just below 6,000. And that is positive. But my experience of this law is that my family and my neighbours wouldn't get off on an adult caution, because it'd be down to the local superintendent. And the people that I know and the people that I hang around with wouldn't be getting a good report from the superintendent. So while it sounds like a great idea, and while it does reduce by 6,000 the amount of people who got a criminal record, you still have 5,000 people out there who are politically unconnected, who are considered, well, not as important as the people who got off. And while it does reduce the numbers, it also gives the police powers to decide whether your life is going to be destroyed or not. It gives them the power to decide whether you can travel around the world. It gives them the power to decide if you have a row with your partner, whether you keep your children or not. It gives you the power to decide whether these people become doctors in the future or whether they can't. And to me, that power shouldn't be with the superintendent. This should not be there at all. The power should be more open and transparent. And while it's an improvement, it's also wide open to abuse. So, look, I've been campaigning on this. I started using cannabis when I was 20 years of age in 1992. As a result of it, I got introduced to the world of being a criminal. I was a criminal from that point onwards. Up until that, I was not a criminal. I hadn't broken any law. I'd never stolen anything in my life, probably mainly because I was afraid what my mother and father would do to me if I got caught. But I never had. I'd never crossed that line. And then I did cross the line, and I seen what it was like. And I seen what it did to a lot of people that I know, and I would turn them off every law and gave them the impression that the police were wrong on absolutely everything. It made it more difficult to enforce other laws that need to be enforced, and it just made the situation worse. So in 1997, I ran for election, didn't get elected, ran for Europe again in 1999, didn't get elected. Eventually I got elected to my local council, all the time while saying I believe cannabis should be legalised. And in the end, I got elected to the European Parliament. I am now part of a group of 5 different groups in the European Parliament who were involved with trying to push the idea of legalising cannabis around the whole of the European Union. So that's where I've come from, and that's how I've arrived here. Thanks
very much. So Bal, I think you missed most of my introduction, but I was just talking about some of the harms of an enforcement approach. And I think amongst many of your fellow MPs, you've been very outspoken on this, and you've taken a bold position in being quite critical of a lot of the harms associated with drug policing. And I wonder if you could just say a few words really about your experience of that as an MP and within your constituency specifically, and the disproportionate way in which the harms of criminalisation and policing land within your community.
Thank you, and sorry for missing your introduction. But firstly, I'd like to start with saying that actually the most used drugs are alcohol and nicotine. The difference is how they're regulated, and that makes such a massive difference. And you're absolutely right. Politicians' job are to keep the constituents, people that we're meant to represent, safe and well. And we're failing in that because the UK remains the drug overdose capital of Europe. And that has a very, very negative impact on how things are legislated. But instead of thinking about what other countries are doing, in every country where they've moved towards a process of legalisation, you've seen drug deaths fall. So if the whole idea of politicians, putting forward policies in this way is to actually keep people safe, to stop crime and to stop people from dying from drug misuse, it's clear that it's not actually working, because the harsher restrictions we seem to put on, the worse these problems seem to get. And we're not actually moving towards a program of reducing harm, because we're seeing more drug deaths, we're seeing more addiction, and we're actually putting less money into it. And we're seeing more crime and more from the proceeds of crime in this situation. And you're absolutely right, there's not sufficient evidence to say that it is a gateway drug, but we have now had a situation because of particular health problems that we're seeing a cannabis industry in the UK without actually looking at the harm reduction of cannabis and other drugs in the way that we should. So it's sending a kind of mixed message, whilst at the same time not necessarily giving people what they need in terms of drugs that have cannabis. We had a number of arguments a few years back to be able to legalise cannabis-based drugs for particularly children with seizures, and now we have a situation where the NHS is not readily providing it, even though it is legalised, which is causing massive issues for some individuals in our constituency. Some children who may have 30 or 40 seizures a day, realising that with these particular medicines, they're living a much better quality of life, and they're not being given what they need by the NHS. So in comes private industry, which has made a massive difference, but then comes the mixed message, because we have a situation where you have private industry able to do these things, able to legally give people appointments and prescribe cannabis-based drugs, but then you have a situation where people are still being criminalised for it. And I do know that in some police forces, they've taken a slightly different approach. You'll see in some areas, they will police the use and possession of cannabis slightly differently. But then you see when it's overdone, you may have heard about the case of Child Q, a young girl who was stripped right down to her underwear to look for cannabis. How much cannabis a young girl could have kept in her underwear is beyond me. But the fact that you're still looking for these very, very small quantities, it means you see the level of criminalisation that can be used. The fact that this mostly happens in black communities. Now, unfortunately, we don't see situations where you have police raids going on in the city. Well, where we are now, when we know there are loads of drug usage, I hear from a Thursday night now, right into the weekend. But you do see this happening more in black communities. And there is no evidence that there is more drug use in the black community than there is in the white community. It can have very, very negative consequences. It means there are disproportionate numbers of particularly black men in prison, starting from quite a young age, from their teens, thinking about our youth offending institutions. You also have a situation where if you are black and your parents may not have been born in this country, it can affect whether or not you're even allowed to stay in this country because of the immigration laws we have. We've had situations where we have young people who are born in this country, but because of our nationality laws may not have been British because their parents may not have been regularised when they were born. Being liable for deportation to another country for possession of what is not necessarily considered a large amount of drugs, but actually, because black people are likely to receive a higher level of sentencing, they reach the threshold for deportation, and that's absolutely disgraceful. We are, unfortunately, in a time where, yes, again, politicians are meant to be acting in the best interest of their constituents, but we happen to convince ourselves that the best way to do that is to be elected. And when you focus so hard on being elected and not actually what you're doing, you find yourself in policy positions which sound like they make sense, which sound like you're being tough on crime, but actually aren't helping. And that's the very, very negative space we find ourselves in today. A few years back, we saw some politicians starting to move more into that space, having more conversations about legalisation. But as we get to a situation where we're on a knife edge, with elections coming up now, and people still not being sure how it may go, we now have a situation where we're back on that footing, got to be tougher on drugs, got to make sure that we're locking these people up that are selling drugs without actually thinking about the usage in our communities and the impact that criminalisation has.
But I mean, Lisa talked about an arms race between the two main parties. As we, the fact that drugs gets drawn into this sort of populist, punitive law and order narratives in pre-election times. It feels like the Labour Party at the moment is in a sort of is sort of going back to the sort of worst punitive populist period of the sort of Blairite years. Some of the not even the sort of Blunkett, maybe more enlightened positions. It's frustrating. It's frustrating for, I think, everybody, particularly that there's an expectation that Labour may well form the next government, or at least in a coalition. It's a distinct possibility. And an area where social justice, issues for marginalised communities should be the bread and butter of the Labour Party, seems to be, and drugs clearly, drug policy and bad drug policy clearly impacts those communities disproportionately. This should be the natural territory of the Labour Party, and yet they seem to be moving away from it, doing things which aren't evidence-based, but, they're evidence-based in terms of maybe focus groups and spin doctors, but then they're not evidence-based in terms of what's going to produce good outcomes for those communities. it's very frustrating. And I think coming back to what Ming was saying, it feels like they're actually misreading the public, and that the public are ready for this. And in many ways, it would be for Labour an open goal, because the Conservative Party's record on drugs has not been good. They should be able to do well from a pragmatic reform platform and shouldn't be afraid of it. So that's why I personally just don't understand what's happening with the Labour Party. So excuse me, you are awesome. Labour drug policy at the moment is rubbish. So I don't want to put. I'm not having a go at you personally, but
No, I know that.
but I mean, so two questions from that rant. One is, do you see any possibility of citizens' assembly becoming a thing? I know we don't really have a culture of them in the UK, but they do seem like a good way to sort of unpick some of these difficult sort of third rail issues. And secondly, do you think, were Labour to win the election, some space might open up for a more pragmatic and less ridiculous position on drugs?
Well, I would hope so. At the last general election, or just before the last general election, I was a political advisor for Home Affairs. And we realised that politicians were going to find it very, very difficult for themselves to say, again, with the views of it would be risking an election. So we tried to give them a way out. We said we would have a royal commission and ask those with the expertise, in the same way we did with, we've done with many other things, to go and investigate and come back with a plan, one that wasn't, tainted with politics, let's say. And we know, because all the evidence points towards legalisation, that that's what they would do. And we would say, well, this is what the evidence suggests. Unfortunately, we're just going to have to follow it no matter what anybody's views are. The problem is that if Labour were to move forward on this policy at the moment, they would actually be really, really heavily hammered by the Conservatives, which I think is quite disgraceful given their track record. We had, this is when Boris first went to be the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson first went to be the Prime Minister. We had a situation where we had 10 candidates going up to be the Prime Minister, and all but one of them said they'd used drugs before. So it seems like at that time that prerequisite for being a Prime Ministerial candidate would be somebody who had used drugs before. But then they turn around and say that other people shouldn't use drugs. The idea of the Citizens' Assembly makes sense, but perhaps not in that form. What we do need is a situation where your individual constituent is making more of this. We know what people think, and you're absolutely right. I believe both parties are probably getting the mood of the country wrong, but that's because the only people that are willing to come and speak to them are the ones that are saying that, oh my gosh, I can smell cannabis coming through the window, oh my gosh, we've got to be tougher on crime. We need other people to speak to politicians on this issue, but this is not the first one that's raised. So we have to look at as many ways as we can to put forward the voice of the people. A number of people would have used drugs before, would have used cannabis in one way or another. The evidence backs it up. We just need the voice of the people to back it up. If it's a Citizen Assembly, fine. If it's something else, fine. We just need people to be talking about it.
So go see your MPs and get your friends and family to go and see your MPs as well and advocate for change. Lisa, on within the Conservative Party, I mean, similarly to the Labour Party, there are reformers and there are, what should we say, status quo advocates. You certainly seem to be from the more reform end of the spectrum. Where do you see the trajectory of change for that debate within the Conservative Party? I mean, both in the run-up to the election and potentially afterwards.
Yeah, I think there are a lot more reformers in the Conservative Party than maybe.
It's not just Crispin Blunt.
It's absolutely not just Crispin.
God bless him.
It's never just Crispin, bless him. No, there are. There are a lot of very, very sensible people in the Conservative Party, particularly on the One Nation side of the party where I sit, who do take ultimately a very pragmatic approach to this. I mean, my pragmatism is sort of, if you like, colours everything that I think, and it's not that I take a particular view of drugs, it's just that I take a very pragmatic view, and cannabis is one of the things that falls under that. It is difficult. I mean, Belle's absolutely right when she talks about sort of drugs and politicians, and the minute you sort of get that drug question and everybody going in any political position, particularly for leader, kind of goes like that. It's also like, in America, you can't admit that you don't believe in God if you're going for a leadership position. In this country, you can't admit that you took an illegal substance. And in that sense, I think, I'm afraid to say, as the public overall, not the people in this room, we tend to get the politicians we deserve in that sense, because we do have this, we see the newspapers, everybody saw what happened to Gove. and others, and we've got to take the heat out of that debate. We've also got to take the politics out of the debate, which is why things like royal commissions, I think, are a very, very sensible idea. Although what I would say is what concerns me, because obviously we've just had the conversations and the ban on NOS, is that the recommendation that was given wasn't the one that was followed by the Home Secretary. So that concerns me. Obviously, that's a Conservative example. We don't know what the Labour Party would do under that, but we know that when it comes to drugs, politicians, generally speaking, go like that.
I mean, can I ask you, when you've taken some quite bold stands publicly as well, have you taken heat from the media on that? I mean,
yeah, but what's interesting is...
Has that cost you politically, do you think? Or does it
still
work as a
here.
benefit?
I think that, and I suspect Bell and Luke would agree with me on this, don't go into politics if all you're looking for is to get elected and re-elected. Go into it because you believe in something and you believe that your participation in our sort of civil society and our civic democracy can make a difference. So I'm also in a very lucky position as a police and crime commissioner. I can take seemingly difficult, bold, courageous, I've been called a whole load of weird things, decisions, because the only people who can fire me are the citizens of Surrey. I don't take a whip. I'm not in Bell's position where, I take a whip. I mean, the Conservative...
I could get in trouble for this.
You could get in trouble for this. I can't. The only people, well, I'd get in trouble, I'm sure, with some people in my office, but the only people I can get in trouble with that matter are the citizens of Surrey. And overwhelmingly, when I speak up on what are seen as difficult issues, I get bombarded with people saying, thank you for saying what no one else is saying. And that, to me, is why I'm in politics, because I can say the things that many people in our communities, and I'm sure Bell and Luke feel the same, don't feel they have the platform to say.
And I mean, Ming, I say that Ireland's a few steps ahead of the UK in terms of this debate politically, and I think it certainly is. There are countries elsewhere in Europe who are several steps ahead of Ireland and many steps ahead of the UK. And we heard from Jindrik just earlier this morning in Czech Republic. And we've now got 5 EU countries, Germany, Malta, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Netherlands, and 6, in fact, who are either have or are in the process of legalising, regulating cannabis. Not to mention most of North America. I mean, you can now walk from the Arctic Circle practically to the equator down the west coast of the Americas without leaving a legal cannabis jurisdiction. I mean, you'd need an enormous joint to do the whole thing. What lessons do you think Ireland has for the UK? And that's part one of the question. The second part is, do you think the European pragmatism and progress is influencing the Irish debate in a way that it isn't influencing the UK? Do you think our sort of, I don't know, a sort of Brexity mindset is sort of closing us off to what's going on around the world? Is it the US that's finally going to shift things? I mean, it's certain. You talked about equal marriage. I mean, it did seem like equal marriage wasn't really on the agenda here until it happened in the US. Then suddenly, things seemed to move very quickly. Do you think we're approaching some kind of tipping point in this debate?
I'll be honest, I don't feel the big political parties in Ireland are influenced by Europe. I'd have to be honest. On the Citizens' Assembly, if I could read their mind, I would imagine they are praying to themselves that they come out and say, no, don't legalise cannabis, don't legalise anything, leave things the way they are. That's the impression I get from the political establishment in Ireland. But if the Citizens' Assembly comes out and says something different, they will go with it, because at the end of the day, the lifeblood of politics is the amount of votes that you get, and you can't really do anything without those votes. But there's something I really don't understand in the UK at the moment, and it's something that you said, Bell, about if the Labour Party come out in favour, they would get hammered. Well, from looking at opinion polls in the UK on the legalisation of cannabis, I'm not saying it's a simple argument to make, and of course you will be bet back by certain publications, but it has never, ever, ever been politically easier to talk about the legalisation of cannabis. And I'll tell you this, I don't get strip searched anymore for talking about the legalisation of cannabis. My friends aren't afraid to come around to my house anymore because of the legalisation of cannabis. I still use cannabis, but I'm not getting any more criminal records. So it has never, ever been easier. So that's why I struggle to see why some big political party in the UK even if they don't give a damn about people who smoke cannabis and just care about getting votes, that they wouldn't come out and say this, because you will bail votes on this. And you won't know where to put them. You'll get so many because it is that popular at the moment. It doesn't require any political bravery at all. And on the ground in Ireland, we have Leo Varadkar or Taoiseach, who to everyone in the world, they think, this guy is amazingly liberal. This is the same guy who expressed concerns about gay people adopting children. This is the same guy who expressed the opinion that when we had the crash in Ireland, we should pay foreigners to go home. Please don't be under any illusion about how liberal this individual is. And now they have found a political space, because they're at 22% in the polls, and about 40% of the population don't want to legalise cannabis. Now we have a situation whereby Leo Varadkar is saying he has serious concerns about cannabis, serious concerns about it. Isn't that keen on the legalisation? So it isn't as progressive as I would like to see in Ireland, but the Citizens' Assembly, I believe, will drive it forward. And sadly, if there was a Citizens' Assembly in the morning in Ireland that said we should all eat raw chicken, the politicians in Ireland would go for it, unfortunately. For me, politics should be about putting your policies out there, and whatever number of votes you get, and then move on if you're not going to win. It shouldn't be about, I'll have a policy that will get me a lot of votes, because that is totally dishonest. From the point of view of the European Union, this group that MEPs have set up, I see two of them there near the front row. The main purpose of the group that we've set up in the European Parliament, well, for me anyway, is to educate myself on what's happening all over the European Union, to help educate someone like Gino Kenny, who's a member of the Irish Parliament, who is going to put a bill before the Irish Parliament in the new year, to help educate him along the way about what's happening, because when he initially put it out there that he wanted to put this bill before our Parliament, he was told you can't do it because of the Schengen Agreement, you can't do it because of what the UN are saying. Well, luckily for us in Ireland, we have someone travelling on to the North Pole of legalising cannabis. They've built a lot of houses on the way that you can stay in and keep warm, and they've worked out how to make this more possible. And now I can go back to the person in Ireland and say, well, actually, in Malta, they've gone this route of allowing cannabis clubs. That doesn't create problems with exporting. We can talk about their experience in Czechia, where they're going more down the route like they are in Malta than they really want to, but that's exactly what's happening. So from the point of view of the influence of the European Union, really, it's playing more of a role of educating people who want to legalise cannabis as to what is the roadmap to making it happen. Because at the moment, there are a lot of barriers in the way, and we're trying to work out how to circumvent these barriers. And one of the big arguments against following the whole Schengen thing or having a problem with what they're saying in the UN is they all talk about the illicit drugs market. Now, it might be a bit of a twist on words to do it this way, but this is the reality. If you legalise it in your country, you're not dealing with an illicit drug anymore. So concerns about Schengen, which is about illegal drugs, aren't there anymore. Concerns about what the UN are saying, that's about the trafficking of illegal drugs, they're not there anymore. So Europe is having some sort of an influence, but I would say the biggest influence in my country is politicians would do absolutely anything for your vote. Don't forget that.
I mean, it would be great to see principled leadership from everybody. I mean, unfortunately, we don't get that. But politicians, you're absolutely right. They do follow votes, and it is striking. The polling shows now, there's been a number of polls showed a majority in the UK in favour of legalisation, a big majority in Labour areas, in fact. I think it's over 60% in London. And it was striking to see what the tipping point in the US was. It was when the majority support was essentially reached. That was when the domino effect began in US state reform process. When reform becomes a political asset, a reform platform becomes a political asset rather than a political liability, then reform becomes not just a possibility, but I think it becomes likely. And the other thing politicians like, if you'll excuse me, is money. And there is votes and money.
We haven't
What's
touched
not
on
to
the
love?
economy.
No, we haven't, and that's really important. And that's why, we talk a lot about reforming of drug policy being an issue for the left and an issue that's liberal. Actually, I sit here as a Conservative politician. I think there's a really conservative argument in favour of drug policy change, which is the market. If we can reform it and regulate it, first of all, we take away a lot of that harm because we have a regulated product. Tobacco, which is a regulated product, we know that illegal tobacco exists. We know that it's full of horrible, nasty things that will make you very, very sick. If we can regulate this in a way that gives us a market, allows to employ people, takes tax, all of that, I think that's an incredibly, arguably right-wing conservative argument for doing it. So I think that exists. What we've got to do is get some politicians of all of our parties to sort of get over that almost sort of fear of what happens if they come out and say, hang on a minute, we need an evidence-based, educated approach.
Yeah,
And we have more workers on strike today. I think about that, and I think about how much we say that we can't spend money on the things that people say that we need right across the country, and how much money that we're seeing in other countries where they have gone down the process of legalisation, and just think about what that could actually do. We're also talking about harm reduction. Yes, there are some addictions to other drugs which cause serious harm. If we need more money for harm reduction, would it make sense to regulate cannabis, get the proceeds of that to help with said harm reduction? And we see other countries doing it, how successful it is. It is a situation in which people are going to use it anyway. There's no law that we've put down which has stopped people from using it. We might as well regulate it and use the proceeds in a way that benefit everybody.
Yeah, it is the definition of madness. We are doing the same thing and expecting a different result.
I can think of a very, very strong, I'm far from being a conservative, I can think of a very, very strong, if you're looking for an argument as to why cannabis should be legalised. Like in Ireland, since I started campaigning for cannabis, if we had legalised it the day that I started campaigning for cannabis, and we took in the equivalent amount of taxation as Colorado, which is a similar population to Ireland, we would have taken in 12 billion euros in taxation. 12 billion euros. We also wouldn't have 100,000 people in Ireland with a criminal record for possession of cannabis, who cannot do any job or guarantee themselves being able to get any job bar two. A politician or a parent, the only two that aren't screened. That's possibly the only job I could have got without an employer saying, he's got a criminal record. Okay, we don't necessarily stop people coming into our company because they have a criminal record, but you know what? We just don't want the unpredictable hassle that might bring. So from the point of view of having a more productive society, if you want people out working 100 hours a week, if that's your buzz, well, you have 100,000 people in Ireland who cannot do that. 100,000 people who can never become a doctor. We have a shortage of doctors. We have 100,000 people who can never become a teacher, because all I know is, and while Ireland has moved along, there's still a lot of priests on the board of management in schools around Ireland. In fact, every second one. Can you imagine going in there as one of the 100,000 and potentially you're going to be the best teacher ever to teach? And they go, sorry, no can do. You have a criminal record for possession of cannabis. So from the point of view of a more productive society and getting everyone to play a part and to be involved, and from a financial perspective, it's a no-brainer. But from the point of view of when it is legalised, because this is going to happen. Originally I just said, will it ever happen? Now it's a question of when, and it's a question of how it's going to happen. For me, I would have an issue with a model which incentivises people to make as much money for themselves as possible out of this industry. I would prefer a model that facilitates people's desire to use cannabis and doesn't do it in such a way that when it's legalised, they can then convince you through amazing advertising, because advertisers can get into your heads and convince you that a car will make you happy, that Guinness will make you happy. And they'll be straight on board with cannabis will make you happy, and if you buy more of us, it'll make you even happier. I would have a problem with that model. I would prefer a model that facilitates people using it, but doesn't, through a capitalist system, basically have to sell more and more and more every year to be a success, just to facilitate the people who are already using it. And to me, the Maltese model is a very good model, and by accident, And as a result of complications, they're going down that road in Czechia, and they're going to go down that road in Germany. And for me, that is the best model, because for me, I just want to facilitate people who use it, not to create a situation where we can sell more and it's going to be better and you'll enjoy yourself more and you'll all be happy if you use it. No, just facilitate us using it. That's the system that I want.
We're running out of time, or have run out of time. Any final brief remarks? Belle?
I was just thinking about what Ming was saying. There's a New York model which is based on a social justice model, which allows a lot of the people that have been criminalised to be the ones that begin to be working in the industry in terms of selling and growing even. I think that makes a massive difference. So it's not just about legalising and harm reduction. It's also about repairing the model of criminalisation and the individuals that is criminalised. I would love to see something like that here. We have only one person or one company in the country which has a licence to actually grow in this country, and that individual CEO of that company actually has links to a Conservative politician. And I think people take issue with that. It needs to be fair, and it needs to be for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of regulation, if we can regulate rather than criminalising, it would be a gift to criminality generally, and therefore it's a gift to everybody, and particularly to young people.
I mean, I think it would have been great to have another hour to discuss how we balance the needs, the interests of commerce and business with the needs of public health and social justice and racial justice and sustainable development. There are lots of interesting and difficult discussions to be had there. Those discussions are unfolding at this conference and elsewhere around the world. And as you say, there are all kinds of interesting models that we can learn from. There's the non-profit associations in Malta. There is a social equity projects that are being deployed in New Jersey and New York and many other US states. And there's a lot to learn from. We're in a kind of laboratory of change when it comes to adult use at the moment. Unfortunately, most people in Westminster don't seem to have visited that laboratory. But I hope that will change. I do sense change is in the air, even if it's not evident on the front line in Westminster. It's inspiring to have politicians who, despite their parties, rather than because of them, are engaging actively in this discussion. I hope that the UK can stay part of this EU discussion. Maybe that meeting you're having later in May with all your MEPs, get Belle along to that. That Brussels meeting, you know the one I'm talking about. I think the thing I take away from this is that change is coming, change is possible. We know what the dynamics of change are. It's partly around public opinion, it's partly around fiscal pragmatism. What motivates different parties and different parts of the political spectrum will change. But it's interesting also that calls for reform run across the political spectrum. It hasn't become a particularly partisan issue yet. It hasn't got dragged too far into the sort of culture war polarization. There's still an opportunity to move forward for this. I remain optimistic. And on that hopefully positive note, I think we'll finish. Thanks very much.